So, let me ask you guys something. Have you ever been to a magic show? The kind where the magician has a beautiful assistant, and for the grand finale, he puts her in a box, says a few magic words, and poof, she disappears. Everyone claps, amazed at the illusion, but what they don't see is the trapdoor, the hidden compartment, the years of practice it took to perfect the art of becoming invisible on command. In my family, my brother, David, was the magician, and I was the assistant. Except there was no applause for my disappearing act. It was just expected. If you've ever felt like the invisible sibling, or the family's resident ghost, hit that like button and stick around, because this story is about the time they tried to put me in the box one last time, not realizing I wasn't an assistant anymore. I was the one who'd built the whole damn theater. It started, as it so often did, with a piece of mail. I was in my study, a room that's my personal sanctuary. It's organized to within an inch of its life, books arranged by subject and then author. Pens aligned perfectly in a ceramic holder, a single, elegant orchid on the corner of my desk. It's a space of calm, controlled order that I built for myself, far away from the chaotic orbits of my family. I was reviewing a logistics report, a document dense with shipping lanes, tonnage calculations, and deployment schedules, the kind of minutia that makes my brain hum with satisfaction, when my assistant brought in the afternoon mail. And there it was. Lying on top of a stack of mundane bills and catalogs was an envelope that screamed importance. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind that feels like it has its own gravitational pull. In the top left corner, the crest of the United States Military Academy at West Point was embossed in stunning gold leaf. My name and address were written in elegant, swooping calligraphy, a hired hand's perfection. My breath caught in my throat. I knew what it was. Of course, this was it. The culmination of David's entire life, or at least, the life my parents had meticulously blueprinted for him since he was old enough to hold a toy soldier. My hands felt strangely clumsy as I slid a letter opener under the seal. A wave of something cold and heavy washed over me. A familiar ghost from childhood. It was that specific feeling of anticipating a family event, a queasy cocktail of obligation, a flicker of genuine hope, and the bracing certainty of impending disappointment. Inside, the invitation was just as magnificent as the envelope promised. The gold crest was repeated at the top. The text, in a formal, serif font, announced the graduation and commissioning of the cadets of West Point, class of this year. And there, under the list of graduating cadets, was his name, David Michael Cartwright. It looked so official, so permanent, a name literally etched into the history of an institution my father revered like a holy temple. A wave of pride, genuine and sharp, pricked at me. Despite everything, he was still my little brother. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, the way his small hand gripped mine in a death grip, his knuckles white. I remembered the time he defended me against a bully in middle school, all righteous fury in a frame that was still too small for his courage. But then, tucked behind the formal invitation, was a smaller, personal note, folded in half. It was on my mother's personal stationery, the one with the pale blue hydrangeas. And the handwriting, unlike the calligrapher's elegant script, was hers sharp, spiky, and hurried. Dearest Catherine, I trust this found you well. We are all bursting with pride for David. It's the culmination of everything your father and I dreamed of for him. We are so looking forward to you joining us to celebrate. So far, so good, standard mom speak. But then came the postscript, the real message hidden in the tail of the letter. P.S. Darling, when you're packing, perhaps think of something simple and elegant to wear. A nice dress. Maybe we wouldn't want anything to, take the focus away from David on his very special day. You understand? Love. Mom, you understand. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a command wrapped in the soft gauze of maternal concern. And I did understand. I understood perfectly. She wasn't talking about a dress. She was talking about me, my job, my life. My entire existence was the something that might take the focus away from David. I was the distraction to be managed, the potential spectacle to be neutralized before I could even arrive. I sank back into my leather chair, the heavy cardstock of the invitation feeling like a lead weight in my hand. The crisp, clean air of my study suddenly felt suffocating. That one sentence, that seemingly innocent postscript, had unlocked the door to a room in my mind I tried to keep bolted shut. The room where all the faded photographs of my own achievements were stored. Suddenly, I was 10 years old again, standing in the cacophonous school gymnasium for the annual science fair. My project was a complex, self-contained aquatic ecosystem. I had spent weeks researching, carefully balancing the pH levels, cultivating algae, and introducing a colony of brine shrimp. I'd typed up a 5-page report on it. I stood there, my heart thumping with pride, ready to explain the intricacies of photosynthesis and saline density to the judges. My parents came to my station first. My dad glanced at the tank, nodded, and said, "Very neat. Katie, look at all those little sea monkeys." My mom patted my head. "That's lovely, dear. Such a clever hobby." Then, a small cheer went up from across the gym. My parents' heads snapped in that direction like magnets finding their pole. "Oh, look, David's is erupting." We all rushed over to my brother's station. His project was a baking soda and vinegar volcano. The most cliché science fair project in existence. It was messy, it was simple, and it was currently spewing pinkish foam all over his trifold poster board. And my parents were ecstatic. My father was laughing, clapping him on the back. My mother was snapping pictures with her camera, exclaiming, "Oh, David, you're a genius, a regular little Einstein." I stood behind them, my detailed report clutched in my hand, and watched them celebrate an eruption of foam while my carefully balanced world of life sat silently on a table, completely ignored. I didn't get a single picture that day, but we had a whole album dedicated to what we affectionately called Mount David. That was the day I learned the first lesson spectacle trumps substance. A loud, messy display of mediocrity was worth more than quiet. Complex success. The memory faded, replaced by another. I'm 16. The smell of chlorine is sharp in the air, the sound of splashing water and the starter's pistol echoing in the natatorium. I was a competitive swimmer, and I was good. I trained before dawn and after school. My muscles in a constant state of ache, my hair perpetually damp. This was the final lap of the 200-meter backstroke at the state qualifiers. I could feel the water burning past my ears, my lungs on fire. I pushed off the wall for the final length, kicking harder than I ever had before. I touched the wall. For a moment, I just hung there, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I turned and looked at the digital scoreboard. A new time flashed next to my name, with the letters SR beside it. State record. I had done it. A thrill, pure and electric, shot through me. I looked up into the stands, searching for my parents' faces, wanting to share this one perfect moment with them. I found them. They were there, all right, but they weren't looking at the pool. They were turned sideways in their seats, their backs to me, holding up a bulky video camera. They were filming the adjacent soccer field, where David's junior varsity team was playing. Later, they explained with great excitement that they had managed to capture the exact moment David almost scored a goal. The goalie just barely got a hand on it. My father boomed over dinner. But the form, son, the aggression. That's the stuff of champions. My state record was mentioned in passing. "Oh, that's great, honey," my mom said, refilling David's glass of milk. "Just try not to get those terrible swimmer's shoulders. It's not very feminine." Lesson number 2. My victories were footnotes in the grand, unfolding saga of my brother's potential. His near misses were more compelling than my certified, record-breaking wins. The final memory that note conjured was the sharpest. It was the winter of my senior year of high school, the season of college applications. The dinner table conversation for months had been dominated by one topic: West Point. It was my father's alma mater, his pride and joy. He spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. He'd been grooming David for it his whole life: the right sports, the right clubs, the meetings with congressmen for the required nomination. David, to his credit, seemed to genuinely want it. He looked great in the photos from his campus visit, his charming smile fitting right in with the history and prestige. One night, I finally worked up the courage to make my own announcement. "I've been thinking about where I want to go," I said, my voice sounding small in the David-centric atmosphere. "I'm thinking of applying to the Naval Academy." Silence. My father slowly put down his fork. He stared at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and mild distaste, as if I'd just announced my intention to join the circus. "The Navy," he said, drawing the word out. "Annapolis." "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been reading about their engineering programs, and—" "Catherine," my mother interrupted, her voice laced with that gentle, condescending pity. "Why would you want to do that all that time on a boat, with all those men? It's so isolating. And the uniforms are not nearly as flattering as the Army's." "It's not about the uniform, Mom. It's not a place for a young woman of your sensibilities," my father declared, as if he knew anything about them. "The Cartwrights are Army men. West Point is our legacy. David is carrying on that legacy." The implication was clear. David was the legacy. I was a strange, inexplicable detour. My ambition wasn't seen as ambition. It was a quaint, misguided whim. A phase. They didn't argue with me, not really. They just dismissed it. They never asked about my application process, my essays, or my physical fitness tests. It was a non-topic. When my acceptance letter came that thick, important envelope that mirrored the one on my desk, now I opened it alone in my room. When I told them, my dad just grunted and said, "Well, if that's what you really want." Before turning back to the television, I looked down at the invitation in my hands, the gold crest of West Point mocking me. My mother's note was just the latest chapter in a novel written over 2 decades. A novel in which I was a secondary character. My lines sparse. My motivations misunderstood. My presence tolerated as long as I didn't pull focus from the hero. "Don't overshadow David." The request was so absurd it was almost funny. How could I possibly overshadow him? He was the son. Their son. The golden child. Graduating from their hallowed institution. I was just Catherine, the weird, quiet daughter who went off to join the Navy for some reason they never bothered to understand. The one who sent polite, impersonal Christmas cards from overseas locations they couldn't place on a map. The one whose career was a vague, abstract concept to them, while David's was a tangible, glorious reality they could boast about at their country club. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. She wanted me to wear a simple dress. Did she think I was going to show up in a sequined ball gown? Did she picture me setting off fireworks during the commencement speech? The request was about my uniform. That much was obvious. My formal dress uniform, with its dark navy blue, the gold stripes on the sleeve, the ribbons on my chest. That was what she was afraid of. My uniform told a story they had refused to read. Each ribbon, each stripe, each star was a sentence in a chapter of my life they had marked "Return to Sender." For a fleeting moment, I considered not going, just tossing the invitation in the shredder and getting back to my logistics report. I could send a nice gift, a check with an appropriate number of zeros. It would be easier. It would be peaceful. I could stay here, in my sanctuary, where I was not an afterthought. But the commander. But then, something else stirred within me. It was that same stubborn, quiet part of my soul that had pushed me to finish the science project, to touch the wall in the pool, to fill out the application to Annapolis. It was a core of steel that had been forged in the fires of their indifference. They had spent my entire life perfecting the art of making me disappear. They had handed me the instruction manual, shown me the trapdoor, and expected me to perform my part in the illusion. And sitting there, in my quiet study, holding the evidence of their latest attempt to erase me, I made a decision. Oh, I would go. I would fly across the country, and I would sit in the audience. I would be the dutiful daughter and the supportive sister. I would wear a simple, elegant dress. I would smile, and I would clap. I would play my part. But the thing about disappearing acts is that they rely on misdirection. You're so busy watching the magician's right hand, you never see what the left hand is doing. And my family had been watching David for so long. They had no earthly idea what I had become while they weren't looking. I picked up my phone and booked a first-class ticket to New York. The days between booking the flight and actually leaving for New York were strange. They felt like the deep, deceptive calm of the ocean just before a squall hits. On the surface, everything was placid. I went about my work, attended my briefings, and spent my evenings in my quiet, orderly home. But underneath, a current was pulling strong, dragging up silt and sediment from the ocean floor of my memory. My mother's request to dress simply echoed in my mind. Not as an insult anymore, but as a challenge, a dare, and to prepare for what was coming. I found myself anchoring myself in the truth of how I'd gotten here. You see, my family's narrative of my life was a work of fiction they'd all agreed upon. It was a slim, uninteresting volume, in their telling. Catherine went off and got some vague, unimportant job on a boat. She was distant, she was busy, she was selfish. The end. They had no idea about the actual story, the epic, sprawling, multi-volume saga of sacrifice, pressure, and sheer, bloody-minded will it had taken to become the woman I was. They didn't want to know. It was easier to keep me as a footnote in David's story than to acknowledge my own library. My father was fond of saying David was forged in the fires of West Point. It was one of his favorite, most dramatic lines, usually delivered with a proud puff of his chest. It sounded heroic, it sounded noble, but it wasn't entirely true. David's path to West Point wasn't a forge. It was a carefully curated garden path, paved with my parents' money, connections, and relentless enthusiasm. He had tutors for his SATs, private coaches for his sports, and a direct line to a friendly congressman for his nomination. He was watered, fertilized, and pruned for success. My path to Annapolis was not a garden path. It was a cliff face I had to scale with my bare hands, in the dark, with no one holding the rope. I remember the day I arrived for plebe summer. It was a sweltering July day, the air thick and humid. I stepped off the bus with a small bag, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Within minutes, the life I knew was systematically dismantled. My civilian clothes were taken. My hair was chopped into a severe, unfeminine bob that exposed the nape of my neck to the sun. I was handed a stack of uniforms and a book of regulations thicker than my high school chemistry textbook. And then the screaming started. For 6 weeks, we were plebes, the lowest form of life on earth. We were screamed at for walking too slowly, for looking at an upperclassman, for breathing too loudly. We ran until our lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. We did push-ups on the scorching asphalt until our arms gave out. The goal was to break you down, to strip away your identity, and to rebuild you as part of a whole. For many of the young men there, whose fathers and grandfathers had walked these same grounds, it was a rite of passage they were prepared for. For me, it was something different. It was the first time in my life I was judged not on my potential to be a wife or a mother, or on how well I stayed out of the spotlight, but on a single, brutal metric: could I handle it? I remember one of my company commanders, a stern, chiseled upperclassman, getting in my face during an inspection. My shoes weren't shined to his satisfaction. "What's your name, plebe?" he barked, his face inches from mine. "Cartwright, sir," he sneered. "Cartwright, you're taking a spot a better man deserves. Do you know that every woman we let in here is one less warrior on the front lines? Prove to me you're not a waste of a good man's billet." The old Catherine, the one from the science fair and the swimming pool, would have shrunk. She would have apologized. She might have even cried later, alone in her bunk. But that Catherine was already gone, burned away by the relentless pressure. A new Catherine looked him dead in the eye, my voice flat and emotionless as we'd been trained. "I will, sir," I said. And I did. I outshined, outran, and outstudied almost everyone in my company. I learned to compartmentalize the fear and the exhaustion. My company commander never complimented me, but by the end of the summer, the sneer was gone. It was replaced by a grudging, almost imperceptible nod of respect. It was the first time I had ever earned respect from a man who wasn't obligated by blood to give it to me, and it was intoxicating. It was worth more than 1,000 of my father's distracted pats on the head. The rest of the academy was just as grueling. I chose naval architecture and marine engineering as my major, a field dominated by men who initially treated me like a curious mascot. They stopped when my grades were consistently at the top of the class. my feminine sensibilities, as my father had called them, turned out to include a mind perfectly suited for hydrodynamics and propulsion theory, while David was at West Point, sending home charming letters about leadership drills and football rallies. Letters my mother would read aloud at the dinner table with tears of pride in her eyes. My letters home were different. I wrote about spending a summer on a yard patrol craft, learning navigation by the stars. I wrote about welding classes and turbine engines. My letters were full of technical details they didn't understand and experiences they couldn't imagine. I remember one phone call in particular. I was a midshipman first class, a senior. I was telling my mother about being selected for a competitive postgraduate scholarship. "Oh, that's nice, dear," she said, her voice distant. "More school. But when will you have time for anything else? Your brother is going straight into the infantry. He'll be leading men right away. His CO says he has incredible potential." It was always like that. A conversation that was supposed to be about me was deftly, almost magically, rerouted back to David. My achievements were measured against his, and always found wanting in some vague, undefinable way. After graduation, I was commissioned as an ensign and assigned to a guided missile destroyer. The first time I walked onto the bridge of the USS Mahan, I felt a sense of awe that left me breathless. It was a city of gray steel, a living, breathing creature of immense power, and I was a vital organ within it. The smell of diesel fuel, ozone, and salt spray was the most intoxicating perfume I'd ever known. My first deployment took us to the Persian Gulf for 6 months. The horizon was an endless, unbroken line of blue. The world shrank to the 500-foot length of our ship. I learned the rhythms of life at sea, the endless watches, the camaraderie forged in close quarters and shared danger, the bone-deep weariness, and the profound sense of purpose. I was responsible for the ship's auxiliary systems, the beating heart that kept the lights on and the engines turning. It was immense, terrifying, and the most fulfilling work I had ever done. Of course, my family saw it differently. To them, I had simply vanished. I missed Thanksgiving, I missed Christmas, I missed David's 22nd birthday. My absence wasn't a sacrifice for my country. It was a personal slight against them. The Christmas phone call was the one that truly broke something inside me. It was a crackling, delayed satellite call. I was huddled in my tiny stateroom, the ship rolling gently in the Arabian Sea. It was 0300 ship's time, but I had calculated the time difference perfectly to catch them after dinner. "Catherine, a Christmas miracle," my mother's voice chirped, painfully cheerful. "Merry Christmas, Mom." "Oh, David is here, of course, and his new girlfriend, a lovely girl. We saved you a plate, but it's gone cold now." The first little twist of the knife. "Your father loves the golf clubs David got him. We put your gift under the tree, but it hasn't arrived yet. The mail is so unreliable from wherever it is you are." "I'm sorry, Mom. Things have been busy here." "Yes, well," she sighed, the cheerfulness evaporating, replaced by a practiced, mournful tone. "We just miss you. It's hard. Your father and I aren't getting any younger. David is always here for us. He never misses a holiday. I just don't understand why you have to be so selfish." Selfish. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was standing on a warship in a hostile region, 8,000 miles from home, surrounded by men and women who hadn't seen their families in months. All of us serving so that my parents could have a safe, peaceful Christmas dinner with their perfect son. And I was selfish. The silence on my end of the line stretched on for too long. "Catherine, are you there?" "I have to go, Mom," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I have the watch." I hung up the phone and stared at the gray steel wall of my cabin. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Crying was a luxury I couldn't afford. That was the day I truly understood. My family and I were living in different universes, with different laws of physics. In their universe, familial obligation was the sun everything orbited. In mine, it was duty, honor, commitment. And the two universes were moving further apart at an impossible speed. From that day on, I stopped trying to make them understand. I poured everything I had into my career. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because the Navy was the one place where my dedication was seen as a virtue, not a character flaw. The Navy didn't call me selfish, it gave me medals. The Navy didn't ask me to be simpler, it promoted me. I remember my mentor, a grizzled old captain named Miller, a man who seemed to be made of salt water and cigar smoke. After my first command tour on a frigate, he called me to his office. I had received a glowing fitness report, but I'd also been criticized by a peer for being unapproachable and overly demanding. The criticism stung. It echoed my mother's complaints. Captain Miller saw it on my face. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me. "Cartwright," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Let me tell you something. In this man's Navy, when a woman is decisive, they call her a bitch. When she's focused, they call her cold. When she's better than them, they call her demanding. Don't you ever let their labels become your truth. Your standards are what make you an exceptional officer. Don't you dare lower them to make the men around you feel more comfortable." I never forgot that. It became my mantra. I took the hard assignments, the ones no one else wanted. I earned my master's at the Naval War College. I was the XO of an aircraft carrier. The weight of responsibility grew, but it felt right on my shoulders. When I was promoted to captain and given command of my own cruiser, it felt like coming home. My family marked these milestones with a sort of confused detachment. "Oh, a captain. How nice." Like a cruise ship, my mother had asked. They couldn't grasp the scale. They didn't understand that a captain in the Navy is a position of almost absolute authority over a billion-dollar warship and hundreds of lives. To them, it was just a title, less impressive than David being promoted to captain in the Army, because they could actually see him, touch him, and understand his role. When I was selected for Admiral, the phone call was almost comical. "Admiral Cartwright," my father had said, sounding baffled. "Isn't that for old men with white beards?" "Sometimes, Dad," I'd replied, a weary smile on my face. But they made an exception. They didn't come to the ceremony. They said the travel was inconvenient. David was in the middle of a training exercise he just couldn't get out of. I stood on the stage, my husband Marcus, a man who had seen and understood every sacrifice, pinning the silver star to my collar. I looked out at the crowd of my real family, the men and women in uniform who had served with me, and felt a profound sense of peace. Their approval was the only one that mattered. So, as I stood in my bedroom closet a few days before my flight to New York, I understood the game. My mother didn't just want me to wear a simple dress. She wanted me to wear the costume of the Catherine she was comfortable with, the vague, disappointing daughter. She wanted me to leave the Admiral in the closet. I pulled out a simple, elegant, navy blue sheath dress. It was tasteful. It was understated. It would make my mother happy. I laid it carefully on the bed. Then, I walked over to the display case on my dresser. I opened the glass door and took out my formal admiral's cover, my white hat, with the heavy gold leaf scrambled eggs adorning the brim. It was heavy in my hands, a solid, tangible thing, a symbol of a world they refused to see. I wasn't going to wear my uniform. I would honor their request, on the surface, but I was not going to let them make me feel small. I was done with the disappearing act. I was going to my brother's ceremony as Catherine Cartwright, and if they couldn't see me, the whole me, then that was their blindness, not my invisibility. I packed the blue dress, but as I closed my suitcase, it was the weight of the gold on that cover that I felt in my bones. It was the weight of my truth, and I was going to carry it with me. The flight from San Diego to JFK was smooth, a sterile, 5-hour limbo in the sky. It gave me too much time to think as the plane descended through the clouds, revealing the sprawling, glittering grid of New York City. I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't the thrill of a warrior returning home. It was the anxiety of an undercover operative about to enter hostile territory, armed with nothing but a simple blue dress and a suitcase full of memories they refused to acknowledge. My parents' home was a handsome colonial in a leafy Connecticut suburb, a 40-minute drive from West Point. It was the house I grew up in, the house that should have felt like my own personal North Star. But as I pulled my rental car into the driveway, it looked less like a home and more like a museum. The David M. Cartwright Museum, to be specific. My mother met me at the door, wiping her hands on an apron. "Catherine, you made it. You look tired," she said, planting a quick, dry kiss on my cheek. It wasn't a statement of concern. It was an assessment, an immediate evaluation that, in some small way, I had already failed to meet expectations. Stepping inside was like stepping into a time warp. The air smelled the same, a mixture of lemon-scented polish, her potpourri, and the faint, lingering scent of my father's aftershave. But the decor had evolved. The living room, once a comfortable space for family gatherings, had been transformed into a veritable shrine. I've been on the flag bridge of an aircraft carrier, a space where every single detail is designed to convey power and history. My parents' living room was a domestic version of that. The mantelpiece above the fireplace, once home to a random assortment of family photos, was now exclusively Cartwright, David, Brigadier General in training. There he was in Little League, hitting a home run, his face a perfect mask of determination. There he was in his high school football uniform, covered in mud but grinning triumphantly. And in the center, in the largest, most ornate silver frame, was his official West Point portrait. He looked regal, serious, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on some glorious future my parents had already purchased for him. Flanking the photos were other artifacts: his varsity letter, a small bronzed football, and a framed letter of commendation from a training officer. My eyes scanned the room, looking for a sign that another child had ever lived there. My gaze fell on a small end table next to my father's worn leather armchair. It was cluttered with old copies of the Wall Street Journal and Golf Digest. Peeking out from under the stack, I saw the corner of a familiar white frame. I walked over, my movements feeling slow and deliberate. I lifted the magazines, the paper sliding against the dusty glass, and there I was, a 22-year-old Ensign Catherine Cartwright, beaming with a blinding, naive pride on the day of my own commissioning from Annapolis. My smile was wide and genuine, my eyes full of a hope that now, looking back, felt almost painful in its innocence. I had sent them this photo from my first duty station, imagining, I suppose, that it would earn me a small plot of real estate on the mantelpiece. Instead, it had been relegated to a side table, literally buried under my father's leisure reading. A quiet, cold fury, sharp and clean, pierced through the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I carefully placed the magazines back on top of the photo, hiding my own face once more. It was better that way. That hopeful young woman didn't need to see this. "Katie, you're here." David came bounding down the stairs, already in his element. He was wearing his gray West Point athletic sweats, and he radiated the easy, uncomplicated confidence of a man who has never had to question his place in the world. He gave me a quick, one-armed hug that smelled faintly of soap and exertion. "Great to see you," he said, already turning toward my mother. "Mom, is dinner almost ready? I'm starving. We ran the indoor obstacle course today, and let me tell you, the tough one is no joke." And just like that, the tractor beam of my family's attention swung to him, and I vanished. I became a ghost at my own homecoming, a silent observer on the set of The David Show. Dinner was, as I expected, a masterclass in the art of my own invisibility. The conversation was a monologue, occasionally broken up by my parents' fawning questions. We heard about every detail of David's final weeks at the academy. We heard about the rigorous tactical problem he'd aced, the pranks his roommates had pulled, the charming daughter of a colonel who had a crush on him, and his grand plans for the infantry. My father listened with rapt attention, interjecting with his own back-in-my-day stories from his time at the point. My mother kept pushing food onto David's plate, as if he were a delicate bird instead of a 22-year-old athlete. "Eat up, David. You need your strength for the big day." I sat there, cutting my pot roast into smaller and smaller pieces. A silent spectator, I tried. Once, I really did. They were discussing leadership, a topic I might know a thing or two about. And my platoon sergeant says the hardest part isn't giving the orders. It's getting the men to trust your judgment when things go sideways, David said, sounding profound. "That's absolutely right, son," my father boomed. "Trust is everything." This was my opening, a small one, but it was there. "That reminds me of something we used to discuss at the War College," I began, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the bubble of their conversation. "The concept of leadership capital. You earn it in small increments every day, so you can spend it when it really matters. Like during a crisis at sea. Is that so? My father cut in, his eyes not meeting mine. He turned his full attention back to David, waving his fork. That's just academic theory. Katie, David. I bet your sergeant was talking about real, gut-level trust. The kind you can only forge in the mud and the grit of the field. Tell me, did you guys get to the live fire exercises yet? The swerve was so fast, so complete, that it left me with conversational whiplash. The door I had tried to gently push open was slammed shut, bolted, and barricaded. The message was unmistakable. My experiences were academic, theoretical, and ultimately irrelevant. His were real. I didn't try again. I retreated into myself, a place of quiet, cold observation. I watched them as if I were a foreign intelligence officer, studying the customs of a strange and baffling tribe. I noted the way my mother's eyes shone when she looked at David. I noted the way my father leaned forward, hanging on his every word. They were so absorbed in the brilliance of their son. They had no idea there were entire galaxies outside their solar system. The true masterstroke of my erasure came after dinner. "Oh, Catherine, I have something to show you," my mother announced, her voice bright with excitement. "I've been working on a little something for the reception after the ceremony, a tribute to our boy." She led us back into the living room and turned on the large flat-screen television. A moment later, a title card appeared in a flowing, sentimental script. David Cartwright, A West Point Journey. It was a slideshow, set to the soaring, emotional score of some Hollywood war movie. The first photos were adorable. I'll admit, baby David in a tiny army-themed onesie, toddler David saluting clumsily, little boy David climbing all over my father's old uniform trunk. I appeared in some of these early shots, a gangly older sister with a protective arm around my little brother. But as the slideshow moved through time, I began to fade. The photos from his high school years were all about him and his friends, his teams, his triumphs. I was a junior officer by then, usually deployed, so my absence was understandable. But it was the West Point section that was the most telling. There were dozens of photos, all professionally taken or perfectly captured by my parents on their frequent visits. David on the parade ground, David in a full-dress uniform, David studying in the library, David laughing with his band of brothers. It was a powerful, moving narrative of his transformation, and I was not in a single one, not one. Then, the final photo of the slideshow appeared on the screen. It was meant to be the grand finale, a family portrait, taken on the grounds of West Point during a parents' weekend. My father stood tall and proud. David was in the center, beaming. My mother stood next to him, her hand possessively on his arm. And there I was. I was in the photo. I had flown in for that weekend as a surprise. I was standing on the end, slightly behind my mother, half of my face obscured by her shoulder. The camera's autofocus had clearly been on David, leaving me a soft, blurred figure in the background. An afterthought. "Isn't that just the most wonderful picture?" my mother gushed. Clasping her hands together, she pointed the remote at the screen. "I think it captures his spirit perfectly. I might crop the end a little bit. The lighting on that side is a bit off. Crop the end a little bit." She was going to literally cut me out of the picture, the one picture I was in. And she'd announced it without a flicker of malice, or even awareness. To her, I wasn't a person in the photo. I was just the end. A bit of poorly lit background to be edited out to better feature the main subject. I felt the air leave my lungs. This wasn't neglect anymore. This wasn't a simple case of playing favorites. This was a systematic, meticulous, soul-crushing campaign to write me out of my own family's history. They were curating their memories, and I didn't make the cut. "I have a headache," I said, my voice a strained whisper. "I think I'm going to turn in." My mother looked momentarily concerned. "Oh dear, do you need an aspirin? You should rest. We have a big day tomorrow." I didn't answer. I just walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. It was exactly as I had left it years ago, the pale lavender walls, the shelf of my old swimming trophies, the faded poster of a star chart on the ceiling. It felt like a museum, to a museum, to a girl who used to believe she could earn her place in this family if she just tried hard enough. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the closet door. I looked at my reflection, the tired woman in the simple travel clothes. But I looked deeper, past the surface, into my own eyes, and I saw her. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't an afterthought. She wasn't a poorly lit section of a photograph. She was a commander. She was a leader. She was a goddamn admiral in the United States Navy. They had built a shrine to a second lieutenant. They had no idea they had a flag officer sleeping under their roof. A slow, cold smile touched my lips. My mother wanted me to dress simply. She wanted me not to overshadow David. She wanted to crop me from the picture. They had tried so hard to make me invisible. Tomorrow, I thought, we were all going to find out just how good a job they'd done. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and painfully clear. A perfect day for a coronation, in my childhood bedroom. I stood before the mirror and prepared for my role in the day's performance. I bypassed the closet where my own dress uniforms hung, encased in protective plastic like relics of a forgotten faith. Instead, I took out the navy blue sheath dress my mother had essentially ordered me to wear. It was a beautiful dress, impeccably tailored and made of a heavy silk that draped gracefully. On any other woman, it would have looked sophisticated and confident. On me, it felt like a straitjacket, a costume for a character I no longer was, Catherine, the simple, unassuming daughter. I fastened a single strand of pearls around my neck, my mother's favorite on me, because they were classic and not too flashy. Every piece of the ensemble was an act of strategic compliance. I was giving them nothing to criticize, nothing to use as an excuse. I was adhering to the letter of their law, a tactic I'd learned long ago. When you want to win, you first have to understand the enemy's rules of engagement. As I looked at my reflection, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She seemed muted. The fire and authority I felt inside were banked. Hidden behind a facade of quiet elegance, it was the perfect camouflage. The car ride to West Point was suffocating. My father drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his polished Lexus as if he were commanding a tank. My mother sat in the passenger seat, chattering excitedly, while David sat next to me in the back. A bundle of nervous energy. He was already in his full dress uniform, the gray fabric and black trim looking impossibly crisp. The white belt and gloves pristine. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets caught in his orbit. "I can't believe it's finally here," David said. "For the 10th time? 4 years, just gone in a flash. They were the best years. Son," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a part of the long gray line now, a legacy. We've made reservations at the Thayer for dinner to celebrate," my mother added, turning to look at him. "The whole family, and we invited the Millers. You remember their son, Robert. He's in David's company." I stared out the window at the passing scenery, feeling like a foreigner being given a tour of a country where I didn't speak the language. The whole family, she'd said. Yet I felt like an accessory, a +1 on an invitation to my own life. Arriving at West Point was like entering another world. The sheer weight of history and tradition was palpable in the air. Ancient stone buildings stood like stoic sentinels, their walls echoing with the footsteps of generals and presidents. On the vast parade ground, known as the Plain, thousands of chairs were set up, already filling with proud families. The sound of a military band practicing in the distance drifted on the breeze, a stirring melody of brass and drums. It was a world I understood intimately, the discipline, the pageantry, the deep sense of purpose. This was my element, yet, in my simple blue dress, I felt like a fraud. I was an admiral walking through a sacred military institution, pretending to be a civilian tourist. The irony was a bitter pill in my throat. As we made our way toward the stadium, the public phase of my erasure began. It was a slow, methodical dismantling, carried out with smiles and pleasantries. My parents, in their element, were constantly stopping to greet people. I was the awkward appendage they had to introduce. "John Mary. So wonderful to see you. This must be the big day," a woman in a floral dress gushed, kissing my mother's cheek. Her eyes landed on me. "And this must be your lovely daughter." "Yes. This is our Catherine," my mother said, her hand briefly touching my arm before dropping away. She flew all the way in from the West Coast just for David's ceremony. Isn't that sweet? And that was it. I was defined by my travel itinerary and my support for my brother. The woman smiled politely at me, and the conversation immediately pivoted back to David. I had been presented and dismissed in a single breath. A few yards later, my father spotted an old classmate. "Bill, you old dog, look at you," he boomed, clapping a stout, red-faced man on the back. The man, Bill, grinned and gestured toward me. "Cartwright, is this your girl? She's the spitting image of Mary." "It is by Durand," my father said proudly. "This is David's older sister, Catherine. Not his daughter. Not even our Catherine. I was David's older sister. My entire identity, my name, my personhood, had been replaced by my relationship to my brother. I was a supporting character. Mentioned only in relation to the star of the show, I smiled. A tight, meaningless gesture as they launched into a loud, backslapping conversation about their cadet days. I might as well have been a coat rack. The most brutal interaction, however, came when we were stopped by a young Army captain, a former student of my father's from a guest lecture he'd given. He was bright-eyed, respectful, and genuinely curious. After shaking my parents' and David's hands, he turned to me. "A pleasure to meet you, ma'am," he said with a polite nod. "And what is it you do?" It was a simple, direct question, a chance to be seen. Before I could even form a response, my mother leaped into the breach, her voice light and dismissive. "Oh, Catherine has a very demanding office job out in San Diego," she chirped, waving her hand as if to brush the topic away. "It's in logistics. All very complicated spreadsheets and things. Terribly boring, I'm sure, but we're so glad she could get away, because today is all about David." The young captain, a well-trained officer, took the social cue immediately. "Of course, ma'am. Congratulations again, Cartwright," he said to David. And with a final nod, he was gone. I stood frozen. A demanding office job, complicated spreadsheets, terribly boring. She had reduced my 30-year career, my command of thousands of sailors and multi-billion-dollar assets, my entire life's work, to the mundane description of a mid-level accountant. She hadn't just minimized it. She had actively censored it. She had built a wall around my identity to ensure no part of it could escape, and cast even the smallest shadow on her son. We finally found our seats in the reserved section. With a perfect view of the stage and the plane, an usher handed each of us a thick, glossy program, the West Point crest gleaming on the cover, the official record of the day. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. It felt heavy, final. I opened it, the scent of fresh ink rising from the pages. I flipped past the opening letters from the superintendent and the schedule of events. My heart was a dull, heavy thud in my chest. I found the section I was looking for, the United States Military Academy. Class of year. Commissioning second lieutenants. I ran my finger down the alphabetical list of names. Carlson, Carter, Cartwright. There it was, David Michael Cartwright, infantry. And then, indented underneath, was the list of his family, the official, permanent record of who stood with him on this day. My eyes scanned the words, and the world seemed to narrow to the small, black text on the page, proudly supported by his parents, Mr. John M. Cartwright, USMA 85, and Mrs. Mary L. Cartwright, and his sister, Miss Catherine E. Cartwright. Miss. The word was so small, 4 letters, a period, and it was a declaration of war. It wasn't a typo. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. They had taken the time to include my father's alumni status, a point of pride that connected him, and by extension, David, to the institution's legacy. But for me, they had stripped me of everything. 30 years of service, gone. A career of sacrifice, erased. A lifetime of achievement, invalidated. They hadn't just omitted my rank. They had actively, deliberately replaced it with a civilian title that rendered me anonymous. Miss was a label for a teacher, a lawyer, a librarian. It was not the proper form of address for a flag officer. It was a lie, printed in ink and sanctioned by my family. For them to submit the information for this program, they would have had to consciously type Ms. instead of ADM. They had looked at my life, at the stars on my collar that I had earned with blood, sweat, and years of my life. And they had decided, no, that's not the story we want to tell. A strange thing happened in that moment. The deep, aching hurt that had been my constant companion for days didn't disappear, but it crystallized. It transformed from a murky, emotional fog into a single, hard, perfect diamond of clarity. The last, stubborn embers of hope that I could somehow make them see me, that I could earn their respect, were extinguished, and in their place, a cold, quiet calm settled over me. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not neglect. This was an act, a deliberate act of familial treason. I slowly folded the program in half and placed it inside my handbag. I snapped the clasp shut. The click sounded unnaturally loud in my ears. I looked at my mother, who was fanning herself with her own program, a blissful smile on her face. I looked at my father, who was pointing out something on the field to David. They were happy. They had their perfect day, their perfect family, their perfect story. And they had perfected the illusion by making me disappear. But the magic trick was about to end. I straightened my back, my posture shifting from that of a guest to that of a commander. I lifted my chin. I was no longer a wounded daughter, hoping for a scrap of affection. I was an admiral, assessing a tactical situation. They had made their move. They had shown their hand. Now, it was my turn. The opening notes of the national anthem began to play, and I rose to my feet with the rest of the crowd. I placed my hand over my heart, my eyes fixed on the flag. I felt no anger, no desire for revenge, just a profound, unshakable resolve. They had erased Mrs. Admiral Cartwright from the narrative. They had no idea that in doing so, they had just set the stage for Admiral Cartwright to make her entrance. All I had to do now was wait for my cue. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of military pageantry, precisely as I knew it would be. The long gray line of cadets marched onto the plain with a synchronicity that was breathtaking. Their movements so unified they seemed to be a single organism. Speeches were given, traditions were honored, and the air crackled with the energy of 1,000 futures about to begin. I watched it all with a strange, clinical detachment. When my brother's name was called David Michael Cartwright, and he strode confidently across the stage to receive his diploma and commission, I clapped along with my parents. The applause was polite, measured. The woman next to me, a mother weeping with unrestrained joy, gave me a strange look. I probably looked cold, unfeeling, but what I felt wasn't coldness. It was the calm of a ship's captain on the bridge in the heart of a storm, every emotion battened down, every faculty focused on the single point of impact. The climax arrived. The newly commissioned second lieutenants recited the oath of office. Their voices joined in a powerful chorus that rolled across the field. And then came the iconic moment the command was given, and 1,000 white dress hats were flung into the sky, a sudden, explosive flock of white birds against the brilliant blue. The roar from the crowd was deafening. The celebration had begun. What happened next was like watching a scene unfold from a great distance. Families surged onto the field, a chaotic, joyous flood of humanity. I saw my parents practically sprint toward David, engulfing him in a hug. My father was clapping him on the back so hard David stumbled, and my mother was framing his face in her hands, her eyes shining with tears. They formed a bubble around him, a perfect, impenetrable sphere of celebration, almost immediately. Friends and their families were drawn into their orbit. Congratulations, David. Your parents must be so proud. A true Cartwright, following in his father's footsteps. The praise was a thick, sweet wave, and my family basked in it. I remained on the periphery, standing by the edge of the manicured lawn. I didn't try to push my way in. I didn't call out his name. I simply stood my ground. A solitary, stationary island in a churning sea of happiness. My role was to be the audience, and I played it to perfection. I saw my mother glance in my direction once, a flicker of something annoyance in her eyes, as if my stillness was somehow spoiling the shot. She turned back to David, adjusting the lapel of his uniform, recentering the universe around her son. It was then that I saw him. He was moving through the crowd, radiating an aura of authority so potent it seemed to bend the light around him. General Wallace, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the man who had delivered the keynote address. He was a 4-star Army general, with a chest full of ribbons that told the story of a lifetime of service and conflict. He was shaking hands, offering congratulations, the very embodiment of the legacy these young officers hoped to join. My father saw him coming, his eyes lit up. "David, look sharp," he muttered, his voice low and excited. "It's General Wallace." My family subtly repositioned themselves, turning slightly to intercept his path. My father puffed out his chest. My mother adopted her most charming smile. David stood even straighter, a look of pure, unadulterated hero worship on his face. This was it, the ultimate prize, a personal acknowledgement from the highest-ranking officer in the armed forces. A story they could tell for the rest of their lives. General Wallace continued his slow, deliberate path through the crowd. He was getting closer. My father subtly cleared his throat, readying his introduction. David's hand was twitching, preparing for the handshake of his life. The general's eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were scanning the faces, a polite, practiced smile on his own. His gaze swept past my family, past me, and then it snapped back. It was as if someone had hit a pause button on the entire world. The general's polite smile vanished. His eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in unmistakable, stunning recognition. The change was so abrupt, so total, that it was like watching a mask fall away. He stopped dead in his tracks. He was no longer just a dignitary working the crowd. He had a new mission. He changed course. He began walking directly toward our group, but his eyes were locked on me. He wasn't looking at the proud father, the beaming mother, or the decorated new lieutenant. He was looking at the woman in the simple blue dress standing off to the side. My father, assuming the general was coming for him, took a half step forward, his hand outstretched. "General Wallace, an honor. Sir, John Cartwright, class of '85, and this is my son, the new second lieutenant." General Wallace walked past my father's outstretched hand as if it didn't exist. He moved past my mother's dazzling, expectant smile without a glance. He bypassed my brother, the hero of the hour, as if he were a piece of furniture. He came to a halt directly in front of me. He was a tall man, and he seemed to draw himself up even taller. His back went ramrod straight. His heels clicked together with a sound that cut through the joyful noise around us like a rifle shot. And then, in a movement so sharp, so precise, so utterly perfect it could have been an illustration in a military manual, he raised his right hand to his brow. It was not a casual gesture. It was a full, formal thunderclap of a salute. Silence. A pocket of absolute silence fell around us, so complete it felt like the air had been sucked out of it. The joyous chatter of the families nearby faltered and died. Heads turned. Everyone was staring. The general's voice, when it came, was a clear, commanding boom that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "Admiral Cartwright," he declared, his voice ringing with a deference and respect that was utterly, shockingly real. "I had no idea you were in attendance. It is a genuine honor to see you, ma'am. Admiral Cartwright." The words hung in the air, glittering and dangerous. They landed in the center of my family's perfect celebration and detonated, shattering their entire world into a million pieces. I watched the fallout spread across their faces in devastating slow motion. My father's jaw went slack. The hand he'd had outstretched for the general was frozen in midair. A pathetic, forgotten gesture. His face, moments before floored with pride, was now a mask of pale, horrified confusion. As a West Point man, as a former officer, he understood the language of this moment better than anyone. He knew the profound significance of a 4-star general saluting first. He knew what admiral meant, and the dawning horror in his eyes was the look of a man realizing he had just committed a catastrophic, unforgivable error in judgment. My mother's face simply collapsed. The brilliant, hostess-perfect smile disintegrated, her lips parting in a silent "oh" of shock. The color drained from her cheeks. She looked like a film director whose Oscar-winning star had just gone completely off script during a live broadcast, turning her masterpiece into a disaster. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror that was part confusion, part social ruin. And David, my poor, golden boy brother. He just looked lost. His face was a canvas of pure bewilderment. He looked at the general, then at me, then back at the general. His brain was visibly short-circuiting, unable to process the data. Admiral Cartwright. He was looking at his sister, the one with the boring office job, and seeing a complete and utter stranger, a figure of immense and terrifying authority who had been hiding in plain sight his entire life. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then I gave the general a slight, respectful nod, the corners of my lips turning up in a small, calm smile. The costume of the simple, unassuming daughter fell away. I was myself again. "General Wallace, it's good to see you too," I said, my voice even and warm. Carrying easily in the quiet, I was back on my own bridge, and I was in command. "Congratulations on a magnificent ceremony. You're turning out a fine group of officers." My words broke the spell, but only partially. The general dropped his salute and stepped closer, his demeanor shifting from formal respect to the easy warmth of a colleague. He completely ignored my stunned family, his focus entirely on me. "Just here unofficially," Admiral Keehee asked, his eyes twinkling. "Cheering on my little brother," I said, glancing briefly at David, whose face was still a perfect blank. I had just acknowledged him, but on my terms, from my new position of power. "He's the new second lieutenant." "Is that right?" General Wallace said, giving David a cursory, polite glance before turning back to me. The real center of gravity. "Well, the Army is lucky to have him. Say, are you still with the Third Fleet? I read your latest paper on naval force projection in the Pacific. Brilliant stuff. There's a lot of talk at the Pentagon that you're on the short list for PACIF LT command." He was talking about Fleet Command. He was talking about the Pentagon. He was talking about a world so far beyond my family's comprehension that it might as well have been another language from another planet. And I stood there, in my simple blue dress that was no longer a costume but the perfect camouflage. And I talked with him. I talked about strategy and logistics and the delicate balance of power in the South China Sea. My family stood frozen just a few feet away, trapped on the outside of a conversation they couldn't enter, listening to a story they had never known. Their perfect day, their meticulously crafted narrative, their entire understanding of their family and their world had been publicly and spectacularly dismantled by a single salute and two simple words: Admiral Cartwright. They had tried to erase me. The most powerful man in the military had just put me back on the map. The conversation with General Wallace probably lasted no more than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. In that short span, the entire tectonic reality of my family shifted, buckled, and reformed into a new, unrecognizable landscape. His casual mention of my work, his reference to a paper I'd written, his talk of Fleet Command. Each word was another nail in the coffin of the character they had created for me. What solidified the moment, etching it into permanence, was what happened next. Drawn by the gravity of the 4-star general, other officers began to drift over. A Navy captain with silver eagles on his collar stepped forward, his eyes wide. "Admiral Cartwright," he asked, his voice full of reverence. "Captain Evans, I had the honor of commanding the USS Porter in your strike group during the 18 Pacific pivot. Ma'am, it is an incredible honor to see you." He shook my hand like he was handling a holy relic. An Army colonel, a friend of my father's, came next, his face a comical mask of shock. "Mary, John, is that—" "Catherine, my God, Catherine, you're an admiral." Slowly, a new circle formed. It was a circle of my peers, a circle of respect. They didn't see David's sister or Mary's daughter. They saw a flag officer. They asked me about mutual colleagues, about naval strategy, about the future of the fleet. I was no longer an outsider. In a stunning reversal, I had become the center, and my own family was on the outside, looking in, their faces pale and strained, listening to a conversation in a language they couldn't speak about a life they didn't know. When General Wallace finally clapped me on the shoulder, said his goodbyes, and moved on, the circle of officers dispersed with respectful nods, leaving the 4 of us standing alone in a pocket of deafening silence on the now emptying field. The celebratory music still playing from the stadium speakers sounded jarring and alien. For a long moment, nobody spoke, nobody moved. My parents wouldn't look at me. My father stared at a spot on the grass as if it held the secrets to the universe. My mother fussed with the strap of her purse, her hands trembling. David looked at me with the wide, haunted eyes of someone who has just seen a ghost. His own triumph, his own big day, had been so completely and utterly eclipsed. It was as if it had never happened. The walk back to the car was the longest of my life. Every footstep on the gravel path felt like a hammer blow. The joyous chatter of other families floating on the air was a mockery. We got into the Lexus, the doors shutting with 4 heavy, final thuds. My father started the car, and we pulled out of West Point in a silence so thick I could feel it pressing on my skin. It was my mother who broke it. Of course, her voice, when it came, was thin and reedy, a desperate attempt to stitch her reality back together. "Well," she began, twisting a tissue in her hands. "That was quite the surprise. Catherine," she paused, then took the fatally wrong turn. "Why on earth didn't you tell us?" There it was, the immediate, reflexive pivot. It wasn't their failure to see, it was my failure to show. The blame was already being laid at my feet. Before I could respond, my father chimed in, his voice a low, wounded rumble. "An admiral," he said, shaking his head as he stared at the road. "An admiral, we just thought you were a career officer. We didn't understand the scale of it. It's not a traditional path for a woman." I looked at the back of their heads, the same heads that had been turned away from me at the swimming pool, the same heads that had nodded dismissively at the science fair, and the calm I had felt on the field remained. I was not angry. I was not hurt. I was simply done. Done with their narrative. Done with their willful blindness. I leaned forward slightly, my voice quiet but carrying the force of a tidal wave. "I did tell you," I said. My mother turned, her face a mess of confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I've been telling you for 30 years, I explained, my tone as even as a flat sea. "I told you when I applied to Annapolis. I told you with every letter I sent from a new ship. I told you with every promotion. I told you with every holiday I missed. I told you every single time you asked me when I was going to get a normal job and settle down. The story of my life was not a secret. You just weren't listening." "We didn't understand," my father mumbled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Understanding was never the requirement," I stated, the words sharp and clean as newly polished steel. "Respect was, and you chose not to give it. You chose to be impressed by a baking soda volcano and bored by a naval commission. You chose to celebrate a near miss on a soccer field and ignore a state record. You chose to list Dad's college on a program, but erase my entire career with the word Ms. These were not oversights. They were choices." The car was silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of judgment, the silence of a truth that could not be argued with. Finally, David spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You're an admiral," he asked, looking at me directly for the first time. The awe and shame in his eyes were a potent combination. "A real, 2-star admiral." "Yes, David," I said, my voice softening slightly for him. He was a product of their system, but perhaps not its architect. "I am—" He just shook his head, slumping back against the seat. "Wow," was all he could manage. We drove the rest of the way home in that thick, transformed silence. The celebratory dinner at the Thayer was never mentioned again. When we got back to the house, I went straight upstairs. I didn't wait for the recriminations or the fumbling apologies I knew would come. I logged onto my airline's website and changed my flight. I was leaving in the morning. I was zipping up my suitcase when there was a soft knock on my door. It was David. He stood in the doorway, looking awkward and small in his civilian clothes. "Katie, he started, then stopped. "I'm sorry. I had no idea. I've been an idiot." "You were the golden child, David," I said, not unkindly. "It's a hard role to turn down." "But I should have seen it," he said, his voice earnest. "I should have asked. I'm sorry." "I know," I said. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of hope for us. A chance that 2 new people, a young Army officer and a Navy admiral, could build a new kind of relationship. One between equals. I left a note on the kitchen counter for my parents. Something came up. Have to leave early. Congratulations again to David. I didn't feel the need for a dramatic confrontation. The war was already over. I had won. Not by fighting them, but by finally, truly, letting them go. That was 6 months ago. I'm standing now on the observation deck of my flagship, the USS America. The Pacific Ocean stretches out before me, a vast, endless expanse of deep blue, shimmering under a setting sun. The air is crisp with salt, and the low, powerful hum of the ship is a constant, reassuring presence beneath my feet. This is my sanctuary. This is my truth. My relationship with my family has changed. The phone calls are different now, stilted, awkward, but different. My mother asks questions about my work. So, where is the ship now? Dear my father, in a moment of what I believe was genuine effort, sent me a book on naval history. They are trying, in their own clumsy, flawed way. They are trying to see the person who was there all along. David and I are building something new. He emails me, asking questions about leadership, about strategy. He sends me articles he's read, trying to understand my world. The hero worship he had for our father is gone, replaced by a cautious, growing respect for his sister. But the most important change happened within me. For so long, my life was a quiet, unconscious reaction to their disregard. I kept striving, kept climbing, hoping that the next rung on the ladder would be high enough for them to finally see me. The irony is, by the time they finally did, it no longer mattered. The validation I had craved from them for decades was meaningless compared to the self-respect I had earned for myself along the way. General Wallace didn't give me my power. He simply held up a mirror in which my family was forced to see it. So, for anyone out there who's ever felt invisible, for anyone who's been told to dress simply so you don't outshine someone else, for anyone who's ever been cropped out of the family photo, I want you to hear this. Stop fighting for a seat at their table. Stop trying to earn their applause. Their approval is a cage, and you were born with wings. Go out there and build your own table. Build your own damn theater. Build your own fleet. And when you've built an existence so undeniable, so powerful, and so true to who you are, you won't need their validation. You will be your own North Star. And trust me, the view from up there is spectacular. Thank you guys for listening. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment below, and share this with anyone who needs to be reminded of their own power. I'll see you in the next one.